Imagine waking to the sound of timber tearing, the intimate frame of your life splitting open beneath your feet, and then looking out to see a dying, bloodied whale where minutes before there had been only empty ocean. That sudden, inexplicable violence. The slow, methodical rescue. The impossible decision to leave everything you own and build a life on a 30-foot wooden yacht. This is not a novel. This is the true story of Maurice and Marilyn Bailey, a marriage forged in a tiny bungalow in Derby, hardened in the cramped, intimate truth of a small wooden boat, and tested by the vast, indifferent Pacific. In Sophie Elmhirst's A Marriage at Sea, we meet two people who choose freedom over convention, and who pay a price neither of them predicted. The story begins in the middle of an ordinary morning at sea, the kind of morning Maurice and Marilyn Bailey had lived through hundreds of times before. Orlin, their small wooden yacht, rocked in a gentle rhythm as daylight pushed across the Pacific. There was no hint that the day would become the axis on which their entire future would turn. Marilyn rose first. She moved around the cabin in the quiet sequence of motions she had memorized over years afloat. Lighting the stove, checking the barometer, noting the breeze, listening for any unusual sound from the hull. Everything seemed normal. Then came the impact, a sound so violent and foreign it seemed to split the world in two. The Baileys had heard storms, rogue waves, and the groaning crescendos of stressed timbers, but this was different. A deep, resonant crack accompanied by the sudden tilting of shelves and the fall of books, the kind of disorienting moment that turns instinct into the only language the body understands. Maurice and Marilyn lunged upward, their first thought not fear but assessment. Orlin had served them well for years. She was a sturdy, beloved vessel. But on this morning, she was dying. When they reached the deck, they saw the cause, a whale, massive, wounded, heaving water in frantic sweeps of its tail. Blood clouded the water. The creature had collided with them in its confusion or pain, and its thrashing had torn an 18-inch wound into Orlin's hull. For a moment, the spectacle was surreal. The vast animal circling, the ocean strangely calm, the Baileys frozen between awe and dread. But below deck, the sea was pouring in. Their world was filling. Once the scale of the damage became clear, the couple moved in the tightly coordinated pattern they had rehearsed countless times but never expected to enact under real threat. Maurice tried to stem the water with blankets and foam, packing the hole with whatever material he could reach. Marilyn began the salvage routine, passing up the items that would matter most: the sextant, the emergency rations, 2 jerrycans of water, the first aid kit, their passports, the most essential charts. They worked with scarcely a word. They knew Orlin could not last. Launching the lifeboat and the dinghy was both a surrender and an assertion of control. They paused only once, long enough for Maurice to take a photograph, Orlin listing, sinking with a stillness that contradicted the violence that had undone her. Soon she was gone. One moment the Baileys had a home, a vessel, and a future mapped in miles. The next they had only a raft, a dinghy and each other. To understand the man guiding the raft in those first stunned hours, Elmhirst steps backward into the years that shaped Maurice Bailey long before he first held a sextant. Born in 1933, he grew up in a household marked by silence, practicality, and the unspoken burdens of illness and physical limitation. His hunched back made him self-conscious. His stutter made him cautious. Both made him observant. He learned to live inside his thoughts. Books became his refuge, and through them he discovered mountains, machines, and flight. Maurice's passions always followed a similar pattern: focus, mastery, and a desire to move beyond himself. Rock climbing, flying small planes, and later sailing, each discipline offered precision, rules, and the possibility of transcendence. He was a man for whom competence was not only a skill but a moral value. He disliked anything that felt sloppy, hurried, or uncertain. This temperament shaped every choice he later made at sea. Elmhirst shows how early hardships formed a man who depended on structure as a bulwark against chaos. His marriage, and later his voyages, were all influenced by this sense of order. It is no surprise that when Orlin struck the whale and water rushed in, Maurice did not freeze or panic. His response grew from a lifetime of overriding fear with method. Where Maurice was inward and methodical, Marilyn was outward-facing, bold, and instinctively social. She came from a gentler household, one that allowed room for curiosity and risk-taking. Unlike Maurice, she enjoyed the unpredictable, speed, adventure, new people. She thrived on connection, warmth, and spontaneity. Yet she was no mere counterpoint to her husband. Marilyn had her own record of daring, mountain climbs, physical endurance, a willingness to step into unfamiliar spaces with a kind of cheerful defiance. Their courtship was swift but not reckless. They recognized in each other complementary forms of courage, his quiet endurance and her fearless practicality. Their marriage, from the beginning, became a shared project. They carved out a life in a modest Derby bungalow, but both were restless, both dreaming of a horizon far wider than the one outside their windows. What distinguished Marilyn, and what would later become vital to their survival, was her ability to move fluidly between roles. She could be emotional without losing clarity, adventurous without ignoring danger, sociable without losing her inner compass. She grounded Maurice as much as he disciplined her. Their strengths braided together into something sturdy, though not always stable. The decision to leave England was not impulsive. It was the culmination of years of reading, dreaming, and testing themselves against smaller challenges. Once they sold their bungalow and committed to the voyage, their lives contracted into a single consuming task, building the boat that would become their entire world. Orlin, a Golden Hind-class yacht, was not merely purchased. She was reshaped, reimagined, made seaworthy by their own hands. Week after week, year after year, they commuted to Southampton to sand, varnish, bolt, stitch, and repair. Maurice obsessed over hull integrity and rigging geometry. Marilyn became the architect of the living space, the galley, the stowage systems, the subtle domestic comforts that transform a vessel from a machine into a home. They sacrificed quietly but completely. Furniture was sold. Evenings became labor. Weekends disappeared into boatyards. They slept on the floor. They counted coins. Friends such as Colin and June Foskett sustained them with companionship and practical help. But the Baileys learned self-reliance through necessity as well as idealism. During these years, they became not only sailors but creators of a floating life governed by shared codes. Orlin was more than a project. She was the embodiment of a marriage built on cooperation, purpose, and sacrifice. When they finally launched, the departure felt both momentous and strangely calm. They slipped out of the Solent not as adventurers chasing romance, but as practitioners following a long-prepared plan. Their route carried them south through familiar harbors and onward to the Canary Islands, each stop a test of Orlin's systems and their partnership. The Atlantic crossing was their first taste of the vastness they had long imagined. Days folded into one another, the rhythm of watches, the tracing of celestial lines across a sky full of navigational promise, the minor domestic rituals that kept them tethered to normality. They swam naked in calm patches, chased flying fish away from the deck, and learned the quiet ecstasy of rainwater after days of rationing. In Barbados and other ports, they encountered cruisers whose lives reflected both the freedoms and contradictions of wandering the world by sea. Maurice, sensitive to the layered histories of colonial spaces, felt unsettled by the traces of empire visible around them. But he also felt affirmed. He had brought his wife across an ocean using skill, patience, and the stars. The crossing revealed what they had gained: self-sufficiency, intimacy, and the intoxicating awareness that they had built a life answerable only to themselves. It also revealed what they stood to lose. The Pacific opened before them like a promise and a warning. Islands rose out of the sea as small paradises, each one a respite and a temptation. They made landfall in places most people would never see: lagoons rimmed with coral, beaches untouched by roads, communities shaped by ocean rhythms. At first, the voyage felt like a continuation of the Atlantic's joy: new friends, shared meals, improvisational repairs, and the constant, almost meditative labor of keeping Orlin seaworthy. But beneath the shimmering surface lay currents of fatigue and tension. Isolation, once a pleasure, grew heavier. Every mechanical failure, every unpredictable swell, demanded not only technical skill but emotional resilience. And emotional resilience is not a resource easily replenished. Morris's insistence on order, precision, and discipline became more pronounced in these months. Marilyn, capable as she was, sometimes strained against the rigidity of life aboard. The sea magnifies everything: silence, frustration, love, and fear. Small disagreements, easily absorbed on land, became significant at sea. Yet the Baileys continued westward, carrying both their unity and their growing fragility with them. Morris's worldview sharpened in the Pacific. Sailing was no longer simply a skill. It had become his identity, the lens through which he measured himself and sometimes others. He believed deeply in the purity of traditional seamanship, celestial navigation, manual repairs, the refusal to surrender responsibility to technology. This belief gave him strength, but also a blind spot. His intolerance for what he saw as weakness or carelessness sometimes obscured the human cost of unbending standards. Yet beneath the sternness was a vulnerable truth. Maurice feared not failure but helplessness. His sense of mastery was the armor that protected him from resurfacing memories of childhood frailty. Understanding him in this way makes the unfolding tension between him and Marilyn more poignant than dramatic. Their conflict was not a clash of tempers, but a divergence of needs, his need for order and her need for space. Life in Pacific anchorages brought color and complexity into the narrative. Days were spent repairing sails, patching leaks, fishing, trading, and exploring reefs. Nights were alive with laughter, songs, and the warmth of sailors who had traveled far enough from home to redefine themselves. Marilyn thrived in these environments. She talked easily, laughed loudly, and tasted freedom in the presence of others. Her sociability, while healthy on land, created friction aboard Orlin. Maurice admired her liveliness but sometimes found it overwhelming. He withdrew into tasks and checklists. She reached outward. These differences did not fracture their marriage, but they changed its contours. What once fit seamlessly now required negotiation. The sea does not allow much room for unspoken resentments. As the voyage continued, the Baileys encountered storms, equipment failures, and relentless wear on their vessel. Orlin, though sturdy, bore scars from every mile. So did they. Nights grew longer, tempers shorter. They faced not only physical danger, but the emotional weight of constant vigilance. Morris's rigid standards sometimes clashed with the messy reality of life aboard. Marilyn's easy adaptability sometimes looked, to Maurice, like carelessness. In truth, both were simply tired. They continued because turning back was unthinkable. These months forged them in ways neither fully understood. They amassed a depth of shared experience that bound them, even as stress pressed them apart. Reaching the Galapagos brought a return of wonder. Sea lions draped themselves across lava rock. Iguanas blinked at them from ancient poses. Boobies stepped awkwardly, oblivious to their audience. The wildlife was astonishing, a reminder of why they had traded safety for the unknown. Yet even amid this beauty, the work never stopped. Fresh water had to be collected and rationed. Spare parts had to be scavenged. Orlin needed constant attention, and so did the marriage that lived aboard her. Morris's seriousness and Marilyn's spiritedness oscillated between harmony and friction. Neither trait was wrong, both were human responses to an extraordinary life. The Pacific was no longer merely a backdrop. It had become a quiet third presence in their marriage, testing, shaping, and sometimes distorting them. The friendships they formed with other sailors added warmth to their journey. Shared meals, borrowed tools, and late-night stories helped them feel less alone. But these relationships also provided mirrors. They saw in other couples both the resilience and the fractures that long voyages revealed. Some partners complemented each other beautifully. Others simmered with resentments that the sea had stripped of disguise. The Baileys observed these dynamics, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with a sense of foreboding. The sea exposes everything. Maintenance challenges intensified, frayed lines, failing bearings, unexpected leaks. Each problem demanded ingenuity and composure. Marilyn adapted quickly, learning repairs she had once left to Maurice. Their survival depended not on one person's mastery, but on both learning to flex. The longer they traveled, the heavier the invisible weight became. Loneliness, exhaustion, and small disappointments accumulated like sediment. Marilyn occasionally drank more than was wise, not out of recklessness, but as a brief escape from the unrelenting proximity of life aboard. Maurice, rather than addressing the emotional undercurrents, tightened his routines. He believed order could solve anything. But order does not mend hurt. Still, they loved each other fiercely. Their arguments were sharp but fleeting. Their reconciliations tender but temporary. They were strong enough to go on, but the foundation beneath them was slowly shifting. Elmhirst slows the narrative here, allowing the reader to see the Baileys in their full humanity, capable, flawed, affectionate, and worn thin. They worked well together, until suddenly they did not. They admired each other, until fatigue made admiration harder to express. This chapter reminds us that maritime danger is not only a matter of storms and whales. It is also the erosion of understanding between two people tied to one another more tightly than most marriages will ever experience. The book grows tense as their journey nears the point of no return. Small decisions that once carried little consequence began to matter. A torn sail left unattended, a repair postponed, a route chosen because it felt simpler. Their vulnerabilities, emotional, mechanical, environmental, began to braid together. Catastrophe rarely arrives as a singular event. It forms quietly in the places where people assume they are safe. Their final passages before the disaster foreshadow everything to come. Weather systems grew unpredictable. Aurelin groaned in ways that unsettled even Maurice. They were tired, low on supplies, and carrying the weight of months of accumulated strain. Yet they pressed on. Turning back was no longer a choice that felt real. They were sailors, and sailors reach the places they set out to reach. Here the narrative tightens. Moments that might once have passed unnoticed now left marks. A snapped line, a poorly timed comment, a misjudged course. Each event chipped away at their reserve. Maurice grew quieter. Marilyn grew more restless. Neither knew how to articulate what weighed on them, and so the pressure thickened. The sea around them was vast, but the emotional space aboard Aurelin was shrinking. Elmhirst turns to the granular details, the fraying of rope, the groaning of wood, the subtle shift in a person's tone. She shows how the Baileys were navigating not only the ocean, but the thinness of their own resilience. They were not failing one another. They were simply running out of margin. The final chain of events leading to the shipwreck was not dramatic but incremental. Each decision made sense in the moment. Each compromise seemed temporary. Each assumption felt justified. But the sea has a long memory. A misjudged repair, a stressed hull, a storm approached too slowly. These strands wound together into the disaster that waited for them. The tragedy, when it came, did not feel like a single blow. It felt like the closing of a circuit that had been building charge for months. When Aurelin was finally lost, torn open by a whale and claimed by the Pacific, the world of the Baileys contracted to a lifeboat in a future narrowed by uncertainty. Rescue came, but rescue was only the beginning. Authorities, insurers, journalists, and fellow sailors all stepped into the void left by the wreck, each with questions, paperwork, and interpretations. Elmhirst documents the practicalities, the statements, the reports, the implications for insurance and maritime law. But she never loses sight of the human cost, the Baileys' grief for their boat, their shaken confidence, the surreal quiet that follows survival. The closing section of the story is softer, more reflective. It follows the Baileys through the years after the shipwreck, tracing how they tried to rebuild a sense of purpose and how they made meaning from an experience that few people on Earth could understand. Maurice and Marilyn's story is not framed as triumph or failure. It is something subtler, a portrait of two people who dared to live outside the boundaries of convention and who bore both the beauty and the cost of that choice. Elmhirst explores how trauma reshapes self-narrative, how events retold over years become both clearer and more mysterious. Her writing honors the Baileys' complexity, neither romanticizing nor diminishing them. In the end, what lingers is not the whale, the storm, or the wreck, but the marriage that carried them through every mile, flawed, resilient, intimate, and utterly human. Sophie Elmhirst's marriage at sea is equal parts travel narrative, marital study, and a meditation on the traditions of seamanship. It tells us how a couple remade themselves in pursuit of an absolute kind of freedom and how that very pursuit created pressures that neither of them anticipated. Morris's technical brilliance and Marilyn's daring were a perfect match for ocean voyaging until small human frailties, chronic isolation, and the compounding of tiny mechanical failures turned tragedy into possibility. What stays with you after this book isn't just the vivid scenes of whale and water, nor only the procedural detail of sextants and sails. It's the intimate portrait of two people allowed to be completely themselves with one another, and the hard question of what that kind of total freedom asks of love.